The first thing I saw was my suitcase sitting on the front porch in 2 black garbage bags. For a moment, I honestly thought someone had broken into my house. Then I tried my key.
How
It
could
didn't
you do
fit.
this to me?
My
Ma, I had
hands
no
started
choice.
shaking
Look at me,
as I
we are
knocked on the door
family.
I had spent 40 years paying for. And then my own son opened it. Mom, Ethan said quietly, refusing to look me in the eye, "You can't stay here anymore." Behind him, my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, stood with her arms crossed like she'd already won. Upstairs, my granddaughter Emma was crying. And that was the moment I realized my family hadn't just betrayed me. They had planned it. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. What would you do if your own child locked you out of the home you sacrificed your whole life for? If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Sometimes knowing we're not alone helps more than people realize. People see an old woman standing alone on a porch with garbage bags beside her, and they think the story started there. It didn't. My story started 40 years earlier in a hospital hallway that smelled like bleach and stale coffee when a doctor told me my husband wasn't coming home. Michael Anderson died on a rainy Tuesday in October. I still remember the sound I made when the doctor said it. It didn't sound human, more like something breaking apart from the inside. Ethan was 11 years old back then. 11. Too young to understand death. Too old not to feel it. At the funeral, he stood beside me in a stiff black suit, squeezing my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. He kept asking the same question over and over. "Who's going to take care of us now?" And every single time, I gave him the same answer. "I will." I meant it with everything I had. Back then, we lived in a tiny apartment outside Dayton, Ohio. The wallpaper peeled near the kitchen sink, and the heater rattled all winter long. Michael had worked construction his whole life, and when he died, all we had left was a small insurance check and a mountain of fear. Most people told me to remarry. Some said I should move in with relatives. Others suggested I let Ethan spend more time with Michael's parents because boys need a strong male figure. But I didn't want someone else raising my son. So I worked, and worked, and worked. During the day, I cleaned patient rooms at Mercy General Hospital. At night, I helped nurses lift patients, changed sheets, cleaned blood, delivered meal trays, and sometimes held dying people's hands because nobody else was there to do it. There were nights I came home so exhausted I slept in my uniform. I missed birthdays, school plays, parent meetings, but I never missed a bill, never missed rent, never let Ethan see how scared I really was. When he was 13, he needed braces. I picked up extra weekend shifts. When he was 16 and wanted a used pickup truck like the other boys, I sold my wedding jewelry except for my ring. When he got accepted into college, I cried harder than I had at Michael's funeral. Not because I was sad, because I thought the hard part was finally over. I truly believed sacrifice worked like an investment. You pour love into your family long enough, and eventually it comes back to you. That's what I believed, and maybe that was my first mistake. A year after Michael died, I used most of the insurance money as a down payment on a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy. The floors creaked and the roof leaked during heavy storms. But it was ours. I painted every wall myself. Michael's friend Carl helped me install kitchen cabinets one summer, while Ethan handed us nails and complained about the heat. I planted roses in the front yard because Michael loved roses. For years, that house became the center of my entire life. Every Christmas morning, every Thanksgiving dinner, every birthday cake, every heartbreak. Everything happened in that house. Ethan used to run down those stairs in superhero pajamas on Christmas morning and jump into my arms. Mom, Santa came. Sometimes I close my eyes and I can still hear his little feet on the hardwood floor. That's the cruel thing about memories. They don't die when people change. As Ethan got older, he became everything I prayed for. Polite, smart, hardworking, the kind of young man strangers complimented. When he graduated college, he hugged me so tightly, I thought my ribs would crack. "We made it, Mom," he whispered. "We, not I. We." And for a long time, that single word healed every sacrifice I'd ever made. After college, Ethan got a decent sales job. He moved into an apartment downtown, and for the first time in years, the house felt painfully quiet. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one night, staring at his empty chair. I should have enjoyed the peace. Instead, I missed the noise. That's the thing nobody tells mothers. You spend decades praying for rest, and once it comes, it feels lonely. Then Ethan met Vanessa. The first time he brought her home, she walked in carrying a peach cobbler and calling me Miss Chloe with the sweetest southern smile I'd ever seen. She hugged me before she even sat down. "Oh my goodness," she laughed, looking around the house. "Ethan told me you practically built this place yourself." I remember feeling proud, seen, appreciated. Vanessa had long dark hair, polished nails, perfect makeup, and a voice soft enough to make people trust her instantly. Even me. Especially me. During dinner, she asked about Michael. She listened carefully to every story. She even cried when I showed her an old photograph of him holding baby Ethan in the backyard. Later that night, after she left, Ethan smiled at me while helping load the dishwasher. So he asked. "I think she loves you," I said. And at the time, I truly believed that was enough. A year later, they got married. I paid for most of the wedding. Not because they asked, because I wanted to. I wanted Ethan to have the life Michael and I never could afford. The wedding took place in a small white church outside town. Vanessa looked beautiful. Ethan cried during his vows. I cried watching him cry. And when they danced together at the reception, I remember sitting alone at my table thinking, "You did it, Chloe. You kept your promise. Your son is happy." If I had known what was coming, I would have held on to that moment a little longer, because that was the last time my family truly felt like mine. At first, having Ethan and Vanessa move into my house felt like a blessing. After the wedding, they rented a small apartment in Dayton, but Ethan's company went through layoffs less than a year later. His hours were cut almost in half, and suddenly every conversation became about money. "I just need a little time to get back on my feet," Ethan told me one evening over the phone. "You know you always have a home here," I answered without hesitation. That was the truth. I never even considered saying no. Vanessa sounded emotional when they came over to discuss it. "Chloe, we don't want to impose," she said softly, wrapping both hands around a mug of tea at my kitchen table. "Just 6 months. Maybe less. Your family," I told her. "You don't have to ask permission to come home." I meant those words. God help me, I meant them. The first few weeks actually felt wonderful. The house was alive again. I heard footsteps upstairs. The television stayed on late. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen every morning. Ethan laughed more than he had in months. Vanessa cooked dinner twice a week and constantly thanked me for helping them. "You raised an incredible man," she would say. Those words mattered more to me than she probably realized. At 67, compliments don't hit the same way anymore. People stop seeing you as someone valuable. You become invisible in grocery stores, forgettable in waiting rooms. But Vanessa made me feel appreciated, at least in the beginning. The changes started slowly. So slowly, I almost missed them. One afternoon, I came home from work and found my living room completely rearranged. The old floral curtains Michael and I picked out together were gone. In their place were long, gray, modern drapes. Oh, Vanessa smiled brightly when she saw my expression. I hope you don't mind. The old ones made the room look dated. Dated. I stood there staring at the bare window for several seconds longer than I should have. They were Michael's favorite, I said quietly. Vanessa's smile faltered for less than a second before returning. Well, change can be healthy, right? I told myself she meant well. That became my habit. Every uncomfortable moment, every tiny sting, every strange feeling, I explained it away. Because that's what mothers do when they're afraid of conflict. A few weeks later, she reorganized my kitchen. I opened drawers and couldn't find anything anymore. The coffee mugs were moved. The silverware was moved. Even Michael's old coffee tin disappeared from the counter. Oh, I donated some things we weren't using, Vanessa explained casually while scrolling on her phone. We, not you. We. I remember forcing a smile even though my chest tightened. I should have spoken up then, but I kept thinking the same thing. They're young. They're stressed. Don't make life harder. So I stayed quiet, and little by little silence became permission. Vanessa had a way of taking over spaces without asking directly. She'd say things like, "This setup just works better," or, "I'm trying to help everyone feel comfortable." But somehow, everyone never included me. My favorite chair disappeared one Saturday while I was at work. The chair Michael bought me 20 years earlier after my back surgery. I came home and found two movers carrying it out the front door. "Wait, where are you taking that?" I asked. Vanessa walked in behind them, holding decorative pillows. "Oh, I sold it online," she said casually. It didn't match the new furniture. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't speak. "That chair wasn't yours to sell." She sighed dramatically. "Chloe, it was falling apart." "No," I whispered. "It wasn't." Ethan walked in right then, tension already written across his face. "What's going on?" "Your mother's upset about the chair," Vanessa answered before I could speak. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Mom, it was just an old chair. Just an old chair." I looked at my son, standing in the middle of the living room I built for him, defending a woman who had sold something precious to me without even asking. And somehow, I was the one suddenly feeling unreasonable. That night, I cried quietly in bed so nobody would hear me. Not because of the chair, because I realized my feelings no longer mattered inside my own home. Months passed. Then Vanessa announced she was pregnant. The moment she told us, Ethan cried. I cried too. Everything changed after Emma was born. For a while, the house felt warm again. Baby bottles filled the sink. Tiny socks covered the laundry room. Laughter returned to the walls. Emma became the light of my life. I babysat constantly while Vanessa worked part-time at a boutique downtown. I changed diapers, warmed bottles, walked the floor at 3 a.m. when Emma had colic. And I loved every second of it. Even when my knees hurt, even when I barely slept. Because Emma loved me the way Ethan used to. Completely. Fearlessly. As she grew older, she followed me everywhere around the house. "Grandma Chloe, can I help Grandma Chloe tell me the story about Grandpa Michael again? Grandma Chloe, your pancakes taste better than Mommy's." Vanessa laughed when Emma said things like that, but the laugh never quite reached her eyes. Over time, another change happened. Vanessa stopped asking. She started informing. "We're repainting the upstairs. We're turning the guest room into an office. We're replacing the dining table." Every sentence sounded like a decision already made. And Ethan, he just went along with it. One evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen after they thought I'd gone upstairs. Vanessa's voice was low. "We can't stay stuck like this forever." We're saving money, Ethan replied. I know. But imagine what this house could sell for in a few years. I froze halfway up the stairs. Sell this neighborhood's value keeps going up, Vanessa continued. It could completely change our future. There was a pause. Then Ethan said something that made my stomach tighten. Well, eventually it'll be ours anyway. I stood there in the dark hallway holding the railing so tightly my fingers hurt. Eventually, it'll be ours anyway, not hers. Ours. That was the first moment fear entered my heart. Real fear. Not fear of aging, not fear of loneliness. Fear that the people I loved had started looking at my home and seeing money instead of memories. But even then, I still didn't believe Ethan would ever truly hurt me. Because when you spend your whole life loving someone, your heart fights against the truth long after your mind begins to see it. And mine was still fighting very hard. The strange thing about being pushed out of your own life is that it rarely happens all at once. It happens inch by inch, comment by comment, silence by silence. And before you realize it, the people you love have quietly rewritten your place in the family. That winter, I started noticing how differently Ethan spoke to me. Not cruelly, not yet, but impatiently, like I had become another responsibility on his already crowded list. Mom, you already told me that story. Mom, you forgot to close the pantry again. Mom, you worry too much. Small sentences, tiny cuts, but enough tiny cuts will still make you bleed. Vanessa, meanwhile, mastered something even more dangerous than open cruelty. Polite disrespect. The kind that leaves you questioning whether you're imagining things. She'd smile while insulting me. Chloe, maybe you shouldn't drive at night anymore. Chloe, are you sure you took your medication today? Chloe, memory problems run in families, don't they? Each sentence sounded caring on the surface. But underneath, there was something else. Something cold. At first, Ethan defended me occasionally. Vanessa, mom's fine. But eventually, even those small defenses disappeared. Because constant pressure changes people. Especially weak people. And my son, though, I hated admitting it was becoming weak. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and stopped short. Vanessa sat at the table with several papers spread neatly in front of her. Oh, good, she said brightly. You're awake. Something about her tone immediately made my stomach tighten. Ethan sat beside her, staring down at his coffee cup. He wouldn't look at me. What's all this? I asked. Nothing serious, Vanessa replied smoothly. Just some paperwork to make life easier. I stayed standing. What kind of paperwork? She slid the documents toward me with manicured fingers. It's just authorization forms, in case of emergencies. So Ethan can help manage bills and appointments if you ever need assistance. I picked up the paper slowly. The moment I saw legal language, my pulse quickened. I wasn't stupid. I may not have gone to college, but 40 years in hospitals taught me how quickly vulnerable people lose control of their lives once signatures get involved. I scanned the document more carefully. Power of attorney, financial access, property management permissions. My chest tightened. This gives Ethan access to my accounts, I said quietly. Vanessa gave a soft little laugh. Well, yes, but only if necessary. I don't need help managing my money. Of course not, she said quickly. Nobody's saying that. But she exchanged a look with Ethan, a look they thought I didn't notice. The kind people share when discussing someone fragile or foolish. I turned to my son. Did you ask for this? Ethan finally looked up. It's just precautionary, Mom. Precautionary. That word echoed in my head long after the conversation ended. I set the papers back on the table carefully. I'm not signing anything today. Vanessa's smile stiffened slightly. You don't trust us. That's not what I said. Then why hesitate? Because something feels wrong. That's what I wanted to say. Instead, I forced a tired smile. I'd just like time to read everything properly. The room grew tense instantly. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. Well, I just thought family should be able to trust each other. That sentence hit exactly where she intended. Guilt. Mothers are especially vulnerable to guilt. We've been trained our entire lives to confuse self-protection with selfishness. Ethan sighed heavily. Mom Vanessa spent all morning organizing this. There it was. Suddenly, I wasn't cautious. I was difficult. I folded the papers neatly and handed them back. I said, I need time. Then I walked away before they could see my hands shaking. Upstairs, I locked my bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the family photograph beside my lamp. Michael and Ethan, both smiling. For the first time in years, I found myself talking to my dead husband out loud. What am I missing here? The room stayed silent, but deep inside, something had already begun whispering the answer. A few days later, another strange thing happened. I came home from work and found Vanessa standing near the mailbox holding several envelopes. Oh, she said quickly. I was just bringing these inside. But one envelope was already open, my bank statement. I looked directly at it, then at her. For one long second, neither of us spoke. Finally, she smiled. I accidentally opened it thinking it was ours. Ours again. Always ours. Never yours. I took the mail from her gently. It says my name on it. Well, mistakes happen. Maybe they do. But instincts happen too. And mine were screaming. That night, I started hiding important documents in an old storage box beneath winter blankets in my closet. House paperwork, tax records, insurance files, Michael's old documents. I didn't fully understand why I felt the need to hide them. I just knew I did. Around that same time, Emma started spending more time in my room. At 16, she had grown into a bright, thoughtful girl with Michael's eyes and Ethan's smile before life hardened it. One evening, she sat cross-legged on my bed while I folded laundry. Grandma Chloe, yes, sweetheart. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Are you okay? I stopped folding. What do you mean? She picked nervously at a loose thread on the blanket. Mom talks about you a lot lately. A cold feeling spread through my stomach. What does she say? Emma looked uncomfortable. She says you're getting forgetful. I stared at her quietly. She says you probably shouldn't live alone anymore. Alone. The word caught me off guard. I looked around my bedroom slowly. My photographs, my books, my clothes. This was my home. Yet suddenly they were speaking as if I were temporary inside it. Emma looked guilty for repeating it. She tells Dad you need more supervision. Supervision, not care, not support. Supervision. The language sounded clinical, controlled, like I was becoming a problem to manage instead of a mother to love. Do you believe that? I asked softly. Emma answered immediately. No, thank God for that child. She moved beside me on the bed and leaned her head against my shoulder. You remember everything, she whispered. You even remember my science project from 4th grade. I laughed quietly through sudden tears. Yes, I do. You're not crazy. The fact that my 16-year-old granddaughter felt the need to reassure me of that broke something inside my heart. A week later, I overheard Vanessa talking on the phone in the dining room. I had been walking downstairs when her voice stopped me halfway. I'm just researching options, she said quietly. A pause. Then well-assisted living would probably be easier than full-time nursing care right now. My entire body went cold. Assisted living. She was talking about me. I stood frozen in the dark stairwell, listening to my future being discussed like a scheduling inconvenience. She's still functional, Vanessa continued. But honestly, I think it's only a matter of time. I couldn't breathe. Functional, not human, not Chloe. Functional. At that moment, fear finally became certainty. Something was happening inside my home. Something planned. Something dangerous. And for the first time in my life, I realized love alone might not protect me from my own family. I used to love birthdays. Not because of presents, not because of cake, but because birthdays meant everyone I loved gathered under one roof. For most of my life, that was enough to make me happy. My 67th birthday was on a cold Saturday in February. Snow covered the front yard in uneven patches, and the windows fogged from the heat inside the kitchen while I cooked. I spent the entire morning preparing dinner: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans with bacon, fresh rolls, and Emma's favorite peach cobbler. I could have ordered food. I could have rested. My knees hurt more these days, and my back screamed every time I bent over too long. But cooking for my family still made me feel useful, needed. And lately needed was a feeling becoming harder to find. Around 4 in the afternoon, Emma came downstairs wearing fuzzy socks and one of my old, oversized sweaters. "Grandma Chloe," she said dramatically, "the house smells illegal." I laughed. Illegal. Like restaurants should get arrested for not tasting this good. That girl could make me smile even on my worst days. She wrapped her arms around me from behind while I stirred gravy on the stove. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I glanced at her. "What makes you ask that?" She shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "You've seemed sad lately." Children notice more than adults realize. Even teenagers pretending not to pay attention notice everything. "I'm all right," I lied gently. Emma didn't look convinced. Before she could say anything else, Vanessa entered the kitchen, wearing a fitted cream sweater and carrying her phone in one hand. "Oh, good," she said. "Dinner's almost ready." "Not can I help?" "Not how are you feeling?" Just relief that the work was nearly finished. She opened the oven, inspected the rolls, then frowned slightly. "These got a little darker than I usually make them." "Usually." I stared at her quietly. My kitchen, my food, my birthday dinner, and somehow she still managed to sound like the hostess while I felt like hired help. Ethan came home around 5 carrying a small grocery store bouquet and a birthday card. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek quickly. I smiled anyway, because mothers survive on scraps sometimes. Even small affection feels enough when you're starving for it. Dinner started peacefully, for about 20 minutes. Emma talked about school. I asked Ethan about work. Vanessa discussed a new coffee shop opening downtown. Normal, almost comforting. Then Ethan opened his third beer. That's when the atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, just enough, like air changing before a storm. "So," Vanessa said casually while cutting her roast, "Emma's guidance counselor mentioned private college prep programs." "That sounds wonderful," I said sincerely. "They're expensive," Ethan muttered. Vanessa sighed softly. "Everything's expensive lately." I kept eating quietly. Then Ethan laughed bitterly into his drink. "You know what's crazy? I'm almost 40 years old and still can't get ahead." Vanessa rubbed his arm sympathetically. "You're doing your best." "No," he said. "I'm drowning." The room grew uncomfortable. Emma stared at her plate. I set my fork down carefully. "Ethan, if you're struggling financially, maybe we should talk about a plan?" "We already have a plan," Vanessa interrupted smoothly. Something about her tone immediately made me uneasy. Ethan leaned back in his chair and took another drink. You know what the problem is? He asked suddenly. I blinked. What we spend all our time taking care of everybody else. The words hung heavily in the room. Vanessa stayed silent. Too silent, like she already knew where this conversation was heading. I tried to keep my voice calm. I'm not sure what you mean. Ethan laughed again, but there was no warmth in it. Come on, Mom. You know exactly what I mean. My stomach tightened. Emma looked nervously between us. Dad? No, Ethan snapped. I'm serious. Vanessa touched his arm lightly. Maybe this isn't the best time, but the expression on her face told a different story. She wanted him to continue. You live here? Ethan said, staring directly at me now. We cover groceries half the time. Bills keep going up. Emma needs college money. We're carrying a lot. For several seconds, I genuinely couldn't process what I was hearing. Then slowly, quietly, I said, I pay the property taxes. Silence. I pay the homeowner's insurance too, I continued. And most of the electric bill. Ethan's jaw tightened. Well, yeah, but what? Vanessa stepped in smoothly before he could answer. Chloe, nobody's attacking you. It's amazing how often cruel people say that immediately after attacking you. I'm simply saying. Ethan muttered things would be easier if everybody contributed fairly. Emma looked horrified. Grandma does contribute, Vanessa warned sharply. No, seriously? Emma protested. She cooks, cleans, babysits, me pays bills. That's enough, Vanessa snapped. The table fell silent instantly. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she looked down at her plate. I felt something crack inside my chest, not because of Ethan, because of the way Vanessa spoke to that child. Cold, controlled, sharp enough to make her shrink. And suddenly, I saw something terrifying. This wasn't temporary anymore. This wasn't stress. This was who they had become. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Look, Mom. Maybe it's time we start discussing long-term plans. There it was again, that careful language. Plans, future, management. What kind of plans? I asked quietly. Vanessa answered for him. Well, eventually this house will need upkeep. Stairs aren't easy forever. You've already had heart issues. My cardiologist said I'm fine. But aging changes things. I stared at her. You seem very concerned about where I'll live. A flash crossed her face. Quick, dangerous. Then it vanished behind another soft smile. We're concerned because we love you. No. They were concerned because they wanted control. And for the first time, I fully understood it. Dinner ended shortly after that. Emma helped me clean the kitchen in silence, while Ethan and Vanessa went upstairs arguing quietly. You don't deserve this, Emma whispered while drying dishes. I smiled weakly. It's okay, sweetheart. But it wasn't okay. Not even close. After everyone went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at unpaid-looking envelopes stacked near the counter. Something inside me refused to rest. So I started checking. Utility bills, insurance statements, tax notices. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed something strange. One of the water bills listed Ethan's name beneath mine. I frowned. That had never happened before. I checked another envelope, then another. My hands began trembling. Several accounts had been changed. Not ownership, not fully, but enough to establish residency, connection, paper trails. I suddenly remembered the power of attorney documents. The conversations about assisted living, the comments about my memory, and in one horrifying moment, all the scattered pieces finally started forming a picture. a picture so ugly I could barely breathe looking at it. This wasn't random. This wasn't care. This was preparation. And somewhere upstairs in the house, I spent 40 years paying for my own son, and his wife were planning a future that no longer included me. After my birthday dinner, I stopped sleeping properly. Every sound inside the house made me uneasy. A whispered conversation downstairs, a door closing softly after midnight, the creak of footsteps outside my bedroom. Once you realize people may be working against you, even ordinary noises start feeling dangerous. For days, I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe Ethan was just stressed. Maybe Vanessa was controlling, but not malicious. Maybe everything could still be fixed if we simply talked honestly. But deep down, another voice had started speaking louder. The voice women my age learned to ignore their whole lives. Instinct. And mine was screaming. The following Tuesday, I came home from work earlier than usual because one of the patients on my floor had been transferred unexpectedly. I remember feeling relieved at the thought of a quiet afternoon. That feeling disappeared the moment I walked into my bedroom. My closet door was slightly open. I always kept it closed. At first I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Then I noticed the blanket box beneath the shelf wasn't pushed back all the way. My pulse quickened instantly. I walked over slowly and lifted the lid. The documents were still there, but they had clearly been moved. Folders sat in different order, tax papers bent at the corners. Michael's old envelope half open. Someone had gone through my things. For a long moment, I simply stood there staring down at the box while cold anger spread through my chest. Not sadness, not confusion, anger. Because now I knew. They weren't worried about me. They were searching for something. I quickly closed the box after hearing footsteps upstairs. A few seconds later, Vanessa appeared in the hallway carrying laundry. "Oh," she said brightly, sounding startled to see me home. "You're early." I watched her carefully. "So are you." She laughed lightly. I took a half day. Neither of us mentioned the closet, but the tension between us filled the room like smoke. That night during dinner, I studied Ethan more closely than I had in years. Dark circles under his eyes. Constantly checking his phone, barely touching his food. He looked exhausted, worried, cornered, and suddenly, I wondered something I should have asked much sooner. How bad were their finances really? A few days later, I accidentally got my answer. Or maybe it wasn't an accident at all. I had just come downstairs around midnight for water when I heard voices in the kitchen. Sharp voices, whispering angrily. I stopped near the hallway before they noticed me. "We can't keep doing this," Ethan hissed. "We don't have a choice," Vanessa shot back. "There has to be another way." "There isn't?" I froze. Then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. "If we lose this opportunity, we lose everything. Opportunity, not home, not family. Opportunity." Ethan sounded panicked. "We just need more time." "We're out of time," Vanessa snapped. "Your debt keeps growing." "Debt?" My hand tightened around the hallway wall. "I told you not to put money into that stupid investment," Ethan whispered harshly. Vanessa lowered her voice, but I still heard enough. It was supposed to work. "How much do we owe now, Silence?" "Then almost 90,000. I nearly gasped out loud. $90,000. I backed away carefully before they could see me and returned upstairs with shaking legs. That entire night, I stared at the ceiling, unable to breathe normally. $90,000. And suddenly, everything started making horrible sense. The paperwork, the pressure, the comments about assisted living, The changing bills. The conversations about the house. They weren't preparing to help me. They were preparing to take control. The next morning, Ethan acted completely normal. That somehow made it worse. "How'd you sleep, Mom?" he asked casually while pouring coffee. I stared at him across the kitchen island. This little boy once cried because he accidentally stepped on a caterpillar in our driveway. Now he sat across from me, hiding financial desperation while his wife searched through my private papers. And still, some stupid part of me wanted to protect him. That's what motherhood does. Even when your heart is breaking, part of you still wants to shield your child from consequences. Later that afternoon, I drove to Patricia Miller's house. Patricia had been my best friend since nursing assistant training back in the 80s. She was one of those women who never sugarcoated anything. Short gray hair, sharp tongue, big heart. The kind of friend who tells you the truth, even when it hurts. The moment she opened the door, she frowned. "You look awful." "I probably do." 20 minutes later, we sat at her kitchen table while I told her everything. The paperwork, the bills, the conversations, the debt, the fear. Patricia listened silently the entire time, her expression growing darker by the minute. When I finally finished, she leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "They're setting you up." Hearing someone else say it out loud made me feel physically sick. "You really think so?" "Yes." I stared down at my coffee cup. "I keep hoping I'm wrong." Patricia's voice softened slightly. "Chloe, good people don't secretly add names to utility bills and search through your documents." Tears burned behind my eyes instantly. I don't understand how Ethan became this person. He didn't become this person overnight. That sentence hit me hard because deep down, I knew she was right. Maybe the signs had always existed. Maybe I just refused to see them. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You need a lawyer." The word made my stomach twist. "A lawyer?" "Yes." "That feels extreme." "No," she said firmly. "Getting thrown out of your own home would be extreme." Silence filled the kitchen. Then Patricia asked quietly, "Did Michael ever leave copies of property documents?" I blinked. "Actually, yes." A memory surfaced instantly. About 10 years before he died, Michael became obsessed with organizing paperwork after one of his coworkers got caught in a nasty inheritance battle. He bought a fireproof lockbox and spent an entire weekend labeling folders. At the time, I teased him for being paranoid. But Michael had simply shrugged. People change when money gets involved. I remember laughing at him. Now those words haunted me. "I think there are documents in the attic," I said slowly. Patricia pointed at me immediately. "Find them." That evening, I waited until everyone was asleep before climbing into the attic with a flashlight. Dust floated through the cold air while old boxes surrounded me. Christmas decorations, baby clothes, Michael's tools. Then finally, tucked behind an old suitcase, I found the metal lockbox. My hands trembled while opening it. Inside sat neatly organized folders, exactly the way Michael left them years earlier. Property deed, insurance records, bank information, and beneath everything else, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Michael's handwriting. I stared at it for several seconds before carefully opening it. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "Chloe, if you're reading this, something probably feels wrong. Trust yourself. Protect this house. No matter who makes you feel guilty for it, love does not mean surrendering everything. Michael." I broke down crying right there in the attic. Not delicate tears, not quiet tears. The kind of crying that comes from finally realizing You've been standing alone for much longer than you admitted to yourself. But beneath the grief, something else slowly began rising inside me. Strength. Because for the first time since all this started, I understood one important thing. Michael had prepared for this possibility, and maybe it was finally time for me to stop being afraid too. The next morning, I called the number written on the back of Robert Hayes's business card 3 separate times before I finally let it ring long enough for someone to answer. I don't know why I was so nervous. Maybe because calling a lawyer made everything feel real. Up until then, part of me still clung to denial. But denial becomes difficult once you start hiding legal documents from your own family. Hayes and Associates, a woman answered politely. I swallowed hard. I'd like to schedule an appointment with Robert Hayes. Regarding, I hesitated, then quietly said, Family matters. 2 days later, I sat across from Robert Hayes in a small office that smelled faintly like old books and coffee. He looked to be in his 70s, with silver hair, wire-frame glasses, and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades watching people destroy each other over money. His office walls were lined with framed degrees and photographs of grandchildren. For some reason, that made me trust him immediately. He listened carefully while I explained everything. The changing bills, the paperwork, the comments about assisted living, the debt, the conversations I overheard. Unlike Patricia, Robert didn't interrupt. He simply took notes quietly. When I finished speaking, he folded his hands together. Mrs. Anderson, he said gently, do you currently have any diagnosed cognitive impairment? The question hurt more than I expected. No. Any dementia diagnosis? No. Has any doctor questioned your mental competency? Never. He nodded slowly. Good. Such a small word. But hearing it felt like someone finally pulling me back towards solid ground. I handed him the documents from Michael's lockbox. Robert adjusted his glasses and carefully reviewed every page. The silence stretched so long, my anxiety started climbing again. Finally, he looked up. Well, he said calmly, the good news is your husband was an exceptionally careful man. A strange lump rose in my throat instantly. That sounded exactly like Michael. Careful, prepared, quietly protective. Robert tapped the property deed. This house is solely in your name. Relief rushed through my chest so powerfully, I nearly cried. No shared ownership? None. What about Ethan being added to utility bills? That means very little legally. I exhaled shakily. For now, Robert continued, your son has no ownership rights to this property whatsoever. For the first time in months, I felt air enter my lungs fully. But Robert wasn't finished. What concerns me, he said carefully, is the pattern of behavior you're describing. My stomach tightened again. What do you mean? He leaned back in his chair. I've handled elder financial abuse cases before. The words hit me like ice water. Abuse, not misunderstanding, not family stress. Abuse. I'm not saying your son is criminal, Robert continued cautiously, but there are clear warning signs here. He started listing them calmly. Attempts to gain financial control, pressure involving legal paperwork, questioning competency, isolation tactics, property discussions, unauthorized access to documents. The more he spoke, the colder I felt, because every single point described my life perfectly. I stared down at my hands. I raised him, I whispered. How did this happen? Robert's expression softened. Good people sometimes make terrible choices when fear and money mix together. Fear, debt, desperation. Part of me wanted to blame Vanessa entirely. It would have been easier. But deep down, I knew something painful. Ethan was still responsible for his own choices. Robert opened another folder from the lockbox. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. "Well now," he murmured. "What?" He turned the document toward me. "This is interesting." I frowned. It was paperwork I barely recognized. "What is it? Your husband established a protective property trust shortly before his death." I blinked. "A what?" Robert explained carefully. "Years ago, after watching co-workers lose homes during inheritance disputes, Michael created legal protections preventing unauthorized property transfers under suspicious circumstances." My mouth slowly fell open. "You mean you cannot be forced out of your home without significant legal procedure?" I stared at him in stunned silence. Michael knew. Or at least he feared something like this could happen someday. Suddenly, I remembered all the evenings he spent organizing papers after work, while I laughed at him for being overly cautious. "People get ugly around property," he once told me. God, he had been trying to protect me even after death. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Robert handed me a tissue quietly. "You loved him very much." "I still do." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Robert's expression became more serious. "I need to ask you something difficult." I nodded slowly. "If your son and daughter-in-law escalate this situation, are you emotionally prepared to defend yourself legally?" The question shook me, because until that moment, I still secretly hoped none of this would go further. That maybe Ethan would wake up, apologize, stop. But another memory surfaced suddenly. Ethan sitting at my birthday table saying they were supporting me. Vanessa discussing assisted living on the phone. The opened bank statements. The hidden debt. And beneath all of it, greed. I looked Robert directly in the eyes. "Yes," I said quietly. He nodded once. "Good." Then he reached for a legal pad. "From now on, you document everything. Everything. Phone calls, conversations, financial changes, statements, threats. All communication involving property or competency," he said firmly. "You write it down immediately." I nodded. Also, he added, "Do not sign anything, under any circumstances." "I won't." "And Mrs. Anderson." "Yes, if possible." "Install recordings on your phone during confrontations." The fact that I needed legal evidence against my own child nearly broke me all over again. After the meeting ended, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel for several minutes. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. People walked past, carrying coffees, talking on phones, living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, my entire reality had shifted. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't becoming forgetful or unstable. I was being targeted. And somehow that truth felt both terrifying and strangely empowering. Because once you finally see reality clearly, fear changes shape. It stops being confusion. It becomes decision. That evening, when I returned home, Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone. She looked up immediately. "Where have you been?" The question sounded casual. Too casual. "Out." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "With who?" I met her gaze calmly for the first time in months. "A friend." Something flickered across her face. Suspicion. She was trying to determine whether I knew something. Good. Let her wonder. Ethan walked in moments later, looking exhausted. "Hey, Mom." I studied him carefully. My little boy was still somewhere inside that tired man. But he was buried beneath fear, weakness, and someone else's ambition. And maybe the saddest part was this: I still loved him. Even now. Even after everything. That night, Emma knocked softly on my bedroom door. "Can I come in?" "Always." She climbed onto the bed beside me, holding her math homework. But after a few minutes, she stopped pretending to study. Grandma, Chloe, yes, sweetheart. She looked down nervously. Are Mom and Dad mad at you? Pain twisted through my chest instantly. No, I lied softly. Emma looked unconvinced. I heard them arguing last night. I stayed quiet. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. I heard Mom say they need to move faster. Move faster, not solve things, not help me. Move faster. Emma looked frightened now. What does that mean? I wrapped my arms around her gently, though my own heart pounded violently. It means adults sometimes make bad decisions when they're scared. She looked up at me. Are you scared? I thought about lying again. Instead, I kissed the top of her head and whispered the truth. Yes. Because for the first time, I realized something terrible. Whatever Ethan and Vanessa were planning, it was getting closer. The day they locked me out of my own home started like any other Tuesday. That's the frightening thing about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves. You wake up believing you're still living inside the same life you had yesterday. I left the house around 9 that morning for a cardiology follow-up appointment downtown. My doctor had been monitoring mild heart rhythm issues for about a year, but thankfully, nothing serious. Before leaving, I stood in the kitchen pouring coffee into my travel mug while Vanessa scrolled through her phone at the counter. Your appointment's at 10, right? She asked casually. Yes. Will you be long? Something about the question made me pause. I don't know. Why? No reason, she said quickly. Just wondering. Ethan had already left for work, or at least that's what they told me. Emma was at school. I remember grabbing my coat and hesitating near the front door. A strange heaviness sat in my chest. Instinct again. That same warning feeling that had followed me for weeks. Then Vanessa smiled sweetly. Drive safe, Chloe. And against my better judgment, I left. The appointment lasted longer than expected because the nurse needed additional tests. By the time I drove back home, the winter sky had turned gray with incoming snow. I remember thinking about making soup for dinner. I remember wondering whether Emma still liked extra crackers in tomato soup the way she did as a child. I remember normal thoughts. Ordinary thoughts. The kind people have before their lives split into before and after. The moment I pulled into the driveway, I knew something was wrong. At first, I couldn't figure out why. Then I saw them. 2 black garbage bags sitting near the porch steps. Beside them stood my old suitcase. The same suitcase Michael bought me 25 years earlier for our anniversary trip to Tennessee. My heart started pounding instantly. I stepped out of the car slowly. The cold air bit against my skin while fear crawled up my spine. No. No, no, no. I walked faster toward the porch. One of the garbage bags had split slightly open. Inside were my clothes, my sweaters, my shoes, my life. For a few seconds, I honestly couldn't process what I was seeing. Then I reached for the doorknob. Locked. I frowned and pulled out my key. It wouldn't fit. My entire body went numb. They changed the locks. I knocked hard. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. Finally, footsteps approached. The door opened halfway, and there stood my son. Ethan looked pale, exhausted, but not surprised. That hurt the most. He knew this was happening. Mom, he said quietly. I stared at him in disbelief. What is this? He swallowed hard, but avoided my eyes. We need to talk. No, I snapped. Open the door. Behind him, Vanessa appeared in the hallway with her arms crossed, cold, prepared, like she'd rehearsed this moment. Chloe, she said calmly, we think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a while. I actually laughed, not because anything was funny, because shock sometimes sounds like laughter. Somewhere else, I repeated. This is my house. Vanessa sighed like I was being unreasonable. We've discussed this already. No, I said sharply. You discussed it. I never agreed to anything. Ethan finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his face nearly destroyed me. Guilt, not confusion, not innocence. Guilt. Mom, he whispered, you're not doing well. I stared at him in disbelief. What you've been forgetful lately, emotional. The stress isn't good for you. There it was, the script, the exact narrative they'd been building for months. Vanessa stepped closer. We found a beautiful assisted living community. I felt physically sick. You planned this. Neither of them answered. Because they didn't need to. I already knew. Open this door, I whispered. Vanessa's expression hardened slightly. I don't think that's a good idea right now. Right now. As if I were dangerous. As if I were unstable. As if I weren't standing on the porch of the house I spent 4 decades paying for. Suddenly, movement appeared upstairs. Emma. She rushed toward the staircase railing, her face pale with panic. Grandma. The moment she tried coming downstairs, Vanessa turned sharply. Emma, go back upstairs. No, Emma cried. You can't do this. Ethan rubbed his forehead painfully. Emma, please don't make this harder. Harder. Dear God. I looked at my son and barely recognized him anymore. Emma pushed past Vanessa halfway down the stairs. She doesn't belong in a home, Vanessa snapped. I heard you talking about selling the house, Emma shouted through tears. The entire world seemed to stop. Vanessa's face went white. Ethan looked horrified. And suddenly, everyone understood too much had just been revealed. I looked directly at my son. Selling the house, Mom? It's not like that? You were going to sell my house. No, he said quickly. We thought maybe eventually. Vanessa cut in immediately. Chloe, this emotional instability is exactly why we're concerned. Emotional instability. I realized then that every reaction I had would be used against me. Every tear, every raised voice, every moment of pain. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I calmed down, completely. Slowly, I reached into my coat pocket and pressed record on my phone without lowering my gaze. Robert's advice echoed in my mind. Document everything. I looked directly at Ethan. Tell me clearly, I said quietly. Are you refusing to let me enter my home? Ethan froze. Vanessa answered for him. We think it's safer if you stay elsewhere temporarily. Are you denying me access to my property? Silence. Then Ethan whispered, Mom, please don't do this. Too late. He already had. Snow began falling lightly around us. Tiny white flakes drifting through the silence while my entire life collapsed. I looked beyond Ethan into the hallway. The family photographs still hung on the wall. Christmas mornings, graduations, birthdays, 40 years of memories. And somehow I was the outsider now. Emma started crying harder upstairs. You can't leave her out there. Vanessa grabbed her arm. That's enough. Something inside me finally broke then. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like ice cracking beneath deep water. I stepped backward off the porch. My legs barely felt steady. You know, I said softly, looking at Ethan. Your father spent his whole life protecting this family. Ethan's face crumpled slightly. And I spent mine believing you'd never become the kind of man who betrays his own mother. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Good. Let him feel something. For one brief second, I thought he might open the door. I saw it in his face. Conflict, shame, fear. Then Vanessa touched his arm, and the moment disappeared. The door closed, right in front of me. I stood there alone in the falling snow, staring at the house I had built piece by piece over 40 years. Then I reached for my phone again. And this time, I called the police. I spent that night in a roadside motel 12 miles from my own house. Even now, saying those words out loud feels unreal. After the police arrived, everything became a blur of humiliation. 2 officers stood on my porch listening while Vanessa spoke in a calm, practiced voice about concerns regarding my health and emotional state. I will never forget how convincing she sounded. That's the terrifying thing about manipulative people. They rehearse compassion. She's been very forgetful lately, Vanessa explained sadly. We're only trying to help her. Help me. By throwing me out in the snow. Ethan barely spoke during the entire conversation. He stood behind her, looking pale and exhausted, while avoiding my eyes. The officers remained polite but cautious. One of them, a younger woman with kind eyes, quietly asked me if I had somewhere safe to stay for the night. That question nearly shattered me. Safe, as if I were homeless, as if I didn't own the very house behind us. I showed them my ID with the house address. I explained the property belonged to me. I even told them about the legal documents. But because Ethan had established residency, and because it was considered a family civil matter, they couldn't immediately force anyone out without formal legal action. Legal action. Against my own son. I remember standing there on the porch while snow gathered on my coat, realizing something painful. Being morally right and being legally protected are not always the same thing in the moment. One officer suggested I avoid escalating things overnight and contact my attorney first thing in the morning. Attorney, not family, not reconciliation. Attorney. That single word told me everything about how bad the situation had become. Before leaving, I looked past the officers toward the staircase inside the house. Emma stood there crying silently. The moment our eyes met, she mouthed 2 words. I'm sorry. I smiled at her anyway, because none of this was that child's fault. Then the front door closed again. And just like that, I was locked out of my life. Patricia drove me to the motel because I was shaking too hard to drive safely myself. The room smelled faintly like bleach and cigarette smoke covered beneath cheap floral air freshener. A buzzing neon sign flashed outside the curtains all night. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the 2 garbage bags containing pieces of my life. Sweaters, family photographs, prescription bottles, my winter boots, 40 years reduced to trash bags. Patricia unpacked some of my things quietly while muttering angry curses under her breath. That woman is evil, she snapped finally. I said nothing, because if I spoke, I knew I would start crying again. Patricia sat beside me on the bed. Chloe, still nothing. Then softly, you need to stop protecting Ethan. That finally broke me. I don't understand how we got here, I whispered. Patricia's expression softened slightly. You didn't get here overnight. Tears rolled down my face before I could stop them. I keep replaying everything in my head, wondering what I did wrong. You loved him too much. I looked at her sharply. How is that wrong? Because some people learn to mistake love for permission. That sentence stayed with me long after she left. Around midnight, I finally forced myself to shower. Standing beneath weak motel water, I suddenly remembered another shower decades earlier. Ethan was 7 years old and terrified of thunderstorms. The power had gone out during heavy rain, and he'd climbed into the bathroom while I showered because he didn't want to be alone in the dark. I remember laughing while he sat on the floor wrapped in towels asking endless questions about lightning. "Will you always protect me?" he asked. "Yes." Even when I'm old, I smiled through tears, remembering my answer. Even then. Funny, isn't it? How mothers keep promises, children eventually forget. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the front door shutting in my face. He closed the door. My son closed the door on me. At 5 in the morning, I gave up trying to rest and sat by the window watching snow pile against the parking lot. That's when my phone buzzed. For one foolish second, my heart leaped. Ethan. Maybe he'd realized what he'd done. Maybe he was coming to get me. But it wasn't Ethan. It was a text from Emma. "Grandma Chloe, are you okay?" My eyes filled instantly. I typed back, "I'm okay, sweetheart. Are you?" Several minutes passed before she responded. No. That one word hurt almost as much as the lockout itself. A second message appeared. "Mom and Dad are fighting." Then another. "Mom says we have to move fast before you cause problems." I stared at the screen while cold fury spread through my chest. Cause problems? I was the problem now, not the people stealing someone's home. I typed carefully. "Don't argue with them. Stay safe. I love you." 3 dots appeared immediately. "I love you too. I'm scared." I pressed my hand over my mouth to stop myself from crying out loud. That child was trapped inside that house with 2 desperate adults spiraling deeper into panic. And suddenly, something shifted inside me. Until then, most of my pain came from heartbreak, loss, betrayal, grief. But now, another emotion started rising stronger than all the others. Protectiveness. Not for myself. For Emma, because children living inside toxic homes learn fear too quickly. And I knew exactly what fear looked like in her messages. Around 8 that morning, Robert Hayes called. "Mrs. Anderson." "Yes. I need you to listen carefully," he said calmly. "Do not confront them alone again." His steady tone grounded me immediately. "I understand. I've already started emergency filings." I closed my eyes in relief. "Thank you. There's more." My stomach tightened. "I reviewed additional paperwork from your husband's trust late last night." And Robert paused briefly. "Your husband anticipated potential coercion involving the property." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means he included specific legal protections preventing involuntary removal from the residence without court review." I stared silently at the motel wall. Michael. Even after death, he was still trying to protect me. Robert continued. "If your son attempts to claim mental incompetence, we can challenge it aggressively." Mental incompetence. Hearing the phrase out loud made my skin crawl. That had been their plan all along. Paint me as unstable, confused, too old to manage my own life. Then take control. Robert's voice sharpened slightly. "Mrs. Anderson, I need you emotionally prepared for this possibility. Desperate people sometimes become reckless when legal pressure begins." I understood immediately. "You think they're scared?" "Yes, and scared people make mistakes." "Exactly." After we hung up, I sat silently for a long time. Then I reached into one of the garbage bags and pulled out an old framed photograph. Michael stood in front of the house, holding 12-year-old Ethan on his shoulders, while both of them grinned at the camera. I traced my fingers across the glass. "How did we end up here?" I whispered. No answer came, only silence. But deep beneath the heartbreak, something else was growing stronger now. Resolve. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped asking whether my son would save me, and started asking how I was going to save myself. The first official letter arrived at my house 2 days later. Not my motel, my house. I made sure to think of it that way every single time. Because if I let them mentally take ownership of that home, even for a second, I knew I'd already lost something important inside myself. Robert sent the legal notice by certified mail early Friday morning. A formal demand requiring Ethan and Vanessa to vacate the property immediately pending further legal proceedings. When Robert showed me the copy before sending it, my hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the paper. I never imagined my son's name and the words unlawful occupancy would appear together on legal documents connected to me. But this was reality now. And reality doesn't soften itself simply because your heart is broken. Robert looked at me carefully across his office desk. You're doing the right thing. Am I? Yes. I stared down at the paperwork. It doesn't feel right. That's because decent people struggle to protect themselves against people they love. His words settled heavily in my chest. Because he understood something important. This wasn't just a legal fight. It was emotional warfare. And mothers are rarely prepared for war against their own children. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. Ethan. The sight of his name on the screen made my stomach twist instantly. For several seconds, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. Hello. Silence. Heavy breathing. Finally, Mom. His voice sounded exhausted, frayed. Part of me hated how quickly my heart still softened hearing him. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. I almost laughed from disbelief. Why was I doing this? I'm protecting myself. We could have handled this privately. You changed the locks on my house. That's not what I meant. Then explain what you meant, Ethan. Another long silence followed. When he finally spoke again, his voice cracked slightly. You don't understand how bad things got? There it was, the truth trying to crawl out. I closed my eyes. How much debt are you in? He inhaled sharply. So he knew I knew. Mom, how much? Another pause. Then quietly, almost 100,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, even though I already suspected something close. How it started with investments. Vanessa. It was supposed to help us get ahead, he continued desperately. We kept thinking one good break would fix everything. But it didn't. No. His voice sounded small suddenly. Young. For one heartbreaking second, I heard echoes of the scared 11-year-old boy who once asked me who would take care of us after Michael died. Except now, he wasn't a child anymore, and fear had turned him into someone I barely recognized. Mom, he whispered. We were drowning. I swallowed hard against rising tears. So you decided to drown me too. Silence. Then it wasn't supposed to happen like this. I almost asked what exactly he thought was supposed to happen. Did he imagine I'd quietly disappear into assisted living while they sold my house? Did he picture himself feeling guilty for a few months before moving on with his life? Did he truly believe betrayal became less ugly if you wrapped it in concern? But before I could speak again, another voice entered the call. Vanessa. Ethan, give me the phone. My entire body stiffened. A second later, her voice turned artificially soft. Chloe, we need to stop escalating this. Escalating. Interesting word choice from someone who threw an elderly woman out into the snow. You locked me out of my own house. We were worried about your health. No, I said coldly. You were worried about money. Her silence lasted just a fraction too long. Then she sighed dramatically. We're trying to build a future for Emma, using my house, using my life, using my sacrifice. I suddenly understood something clearly in that moment. Vanessa truly believed she was justified. That's what made her dangerous. People who know they're wrong sometimes stop. People who convince themselves they're righteous become relentless. You need to leave my house, I said calmly. It's Ethan's home too. No, I replied quietly. It isn't. And for the first time since all this began, I hung up first. That small action shouldn't have mattered. But it did. Because control returns in tiny pieces before it ever comes back fully. That evening, Robert arrived at the motel carrying additional documents. He looked tired. Bad news, he said immediately. My stomach dropped. What now? He handed me a printed file. Your son and daughter-in-law have been consulting a realtor. I stared at him. What? There's evidence they were discussing listing the property. The room spun slightly, even though I already suspected it. Seeing proof hurt differently. Robert placed another paper in front of me. Projected market value estimates, suggested renovations, potential sale ranges. My hands began shaking violently. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was planning. Detailed planning. Vanessa hadn't simply wanted security. She wanted profit. I don't understand, I whispered. How could Ethan think he had the right? Robert's expression remained calm, but firm. People justify terrible behavior when financial panic combines with entitlement. Entitlement. That word echoed painfully. Because maybe somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped seeing the house as something I built. Maybe he started viewing it as an inheritance already owed to him. Not a home. Not memories. Not sacrifice. Just future money waiting to become his. My chest tightened painfully. I raised him better than this. Robert looked at me carefully. You raised him with love. Unfortunately, love doesn't guarantee character forever. After he left, I sat alone for a long time staring at the motel television without actually watching it. Eventually, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Emma. Can I call you? I answered immediately. The moment I heard her voice, she started crying. Grandma Chloe. Hey, sweetheart. Breathe for me. They're fighting all the time now. Pain twisted through my chest. What happened? Dad got the lawyer letter. Of course. And Emma sniffled. Mom screamed for like an hour. I closed my eyes. In the background, I could hear muffled arguing downstairs. Then Emma whispered, I heard Mom say if the house deal falls apart, they're ruined. House deal. Not family, not reconciliation, a deal. That single phrase stripped away the last illusion I still clung to. This had never been about helping me. It had always been about the house. Emma, I said softly, I need you to listen carefully. Okay, you stay out of their arguments. Promise me. But Grandma, promise me? Quietly, I promise. I swallowed hard. Good girl. Then her voice dropped even lower. Grandma, yes. I heard Dad crying last night. That caught me off guard. What he thought everybody was asleep. I leaned back slowly against the motel headboard. He kept saying, this wasn't supposed to happen. My eyes burned instantly. Because, despite everything, that sounded exactly like Ethan. Weak, lost, ashamed, and somehow that hurt almost more than pure cruelty would have. Emma spoke again. I think Dad's scared of Mom. The words landed heavily. Not because they excused him, but because they explained something important. Fear had infected that entire house. Vanessa feared losing money. Ethan feared failure. Emma feared conflict. And me, I feared losing my family completely. But somewhere during that conversation, another realization settled quietly inside me. Fear was exactly what allowed the situation to happen in the first place. Everyone inside that house was acting out of fear. everyone except Michael. Even years after death, he had prepared calmly, carefully, without panic. And suddenly, I understood what I needed to become if I wanted to survive this. Not louder, not crueler, stronger. 3 nights after Ethan received Robert's legal notice, Emma showed up outside my motel room carrying a backpack and crying so hard she could barely breathe. When I opened the door and saw her standing there alone in the freezing dark, my heart nearly stopped. Emma. She threw herself into my arms immediately. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Grandma Chloe." I pulled her inside quickly and locked the door behind her. "What happened? Are you okay?" She nodded rapidly, though tears kept pouring down her face. "I told Mom I wanted to see you, and she lost it." Fear twisted through my stomach. "Did she hurt you?" "No." Emma wiped her eyes shakily. "But they've been screaming at each other nonstop." I guided her to sit on the bed while I wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. For several moments, she just cried quietly while I rubbed her back the same way I used to when she was little. "You're safe," I whispered. "Take your time." Finally, she looked up at me with swollen red eyes. "Dad's getting worse." I stayed silent, because deep down, I already knew. "He barely sleeps anymore," Emma continued. "And Mom keeps talking about money and lawyers and how everything's falling apart." The motel room suddenly felt smaller, heavier, like all the poison from that house had followed her here. Then Emma reached into her backpack. "I brought something." My stomach tightened instantly. "What is it?" She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. "I recorded them." I froze. "Emma?" They didn't know I was upstairs. Her voice cracked. I didn't know what else to do. Slowly, carefully, she handed me the phone. The recording was already open. My thumb hovered uncertainly over the play button. Part of me didn't want to hear it, because once spoken aloud, some truths become impossible to survive unchanged. But another part of me, the stronger part, now pressed play anyway. At first, there was only muffled arguing, cabinet doors slamming, footsteps. Then Vanessa's voice exploded through the speaker. "She's ruining everything." Ethan sounded exhausted. "She's my mother, and we're drowning because of her." I closed my eyes briefly. Emma stared at the floor while twisting the blanket tightly in her hands. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice lower now. "We never should have locked her out." Relief and heartbreak crashed into me simultaneously. He knew. Dear God, he knew. Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Well, it's a little late for guilt now. We crossed a line." "No," Vanessa snapped. "We did what we had to do." The next few seconds changed everything. Because then Vanessa said the one thing none of us could ever take back. If she would have just signed the papers months ago, none of this would be happening. My pulse stopped cold. Papers. Not concern, not health, not safety. Papers. Ethan sounded panicked suddenly. "Keep your voice down." "I'm tired of pretending," Vanessa shouted. "We needed control of the property before your mother figured things out." I looked at Emma slowly. The poor girl was crying again now. "She kept saying worse things after that," Emma whispered. The recording continued. "You said the trust documents wouldn't matter," Ethan hissed. "I didn't know about the damn trust. Michael." The room tilted slightly around me. Every instinct Michael had followed years ago had been right. Every precaution, every warning, every fear. And then came the sentence that finally shattered whatever remained of my old life. Vanessa's voice turned sharp and cold. "If we lose this house, we lose everything. Not home, not family, the house. That was all this had ever been about." I stopped the recording with trembling hands. Silence filled the motel room. Heavy, permanent. Emma looked terrified now. "Grandma Chloe, are they gonna get arrested?" I stared at the phone for several long seconds before answering. "I don't know. And honestly, I didn't. Because despite everything, part of me still resisted destroying my own son completely. That's the curse of motherhood. Even after betrayal, some part of your heart still searches desperately for a way to save your child from himself." Emma wiped her face. "I heard Dad crying again after that fight. Pain tightened inside my chest. He kept saying he messed everything up." I looked away quickly before she could see tears forming in my eyes again. Because hearing Ethan was suffering should not have comforted me. But some broken part of me still needed proof he had a conscience left. Grandma Emma whispered. "Yes, I don't think Dad's evil. Neither did I. And somehow that made everything worse. If Ethan were simply cruel, I could hate him cleanly. But he wasn't. He was weak. Weak enough to follow someone else's greed. Weak enough to betray the woman who spent her life protecting him. Weak enough to sacrifice his own peace, trying to escape financial failure. Weakness destroys families just as completely as cruelty does. Sometimes more completely. A knock at the motel door interrupted us. Both of us jumped. Then Patricia's voice called out, "It's me." I opened the door quickly. Patricia stepped inside carrying takeout bags before stopping abruptly when she saw Emma. "Oh, honey." Emma immediately stood and hugged her tightly too. Patricia looked at me over Emma's shoulder. "Something terrible happened." I nodded once. Later that night, after Emma finally fell asleep curled beneath motel blankets, I sat at the small table with Patricia while she listened to the recording through headphones. Her expression darkened with every passing second. When it ended, she slowly removed the headphones. "Well," she said quietly, "that's your proof." Proof? Such a cold word for something that hurt so deeply. I stared toward the sleeping figure of my granddaughter. "She shouldn't have been involved in this." "No," Patricia agreed softly, "but she loves you." The room fell silent again. Then Patricia leaned closer. Chloe listened carefully to me. I looked up. "You need to stop thinking about protecting Ethan from consequences." My throat tightened immediately. "He's still my son." "And you're still his mother," she said firmly, "which makes what he did even worse." I looked down at my hands. "I keep remembering him as a little boy." Patricia's voice softened slightly. "That little boy grew up, Chloe." Tears blurred my vision instantly. "I know. And now, you need to protect yourself." Protect yourself. Such simple words. Yet women my age were rarely taught how to do it. We were taught endurance, sacrifice, forgiveness, but not protection, especially not from our own children. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You didn't create this situation." "No," I whispered, but I ignored it too long. That truth hurt badly because it was real. I ignored warning signs. I excused behavior. I confused peacekeeping with love. And slowly, almost invisibly, I surrendered pieces of my power until one day I found myself standing outside my own front door in the snow. Never again. That thought came suddenly, clear, sharp. Never again. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed. A message from Robert Hayes. "We have enough now. Be ready tomorrow morning." I stared at the words while my pulse slowly accelerated. Tomorrow. Everything was about to change. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid anymore. The morning I went back to my house, I wore the same dark blue coat Michael bought me 15 years earlier for Christmas. I don't know why that mattered. Maybe because I needed to feel him with me. Maybe because somewhere deep down, I still felt like I was walking into battle. Snow covered the sidewalks in uneven patches as Robert drove us through the neighborhood. Patricia sat beside me in the back seat, gripping my hand tightly enough to hurt. Neither of us spoke much. There are moments in life when words stop being useful. This was one of them. As we turned onto my street, my stomach tightened instantly. My house stood exactly where it always had. The white shutters, the front porch swing Michael built himself, the rose bushes buried beneath winter frost. Everything looked normal, and somehow that made the betrayal feel even uglier. Because evil rarely announces itself with dramatic music or broken windows. Sometimes it lives quietly inside ordinary homes. Robert parked near the curb and turned toward me calmly. "Are you ready?" "No." I wasn't. I wasn't ready to see my son standing against me. I wasn't ready to hear excuses. I wasn't ready to discover how far Vanessa would go. But I nodded anyway. Because some moments in life arrive, whether you're emotionally prepared or not. A police cruiser pulled up behind us seconds later. 2 officers stepped out, including the same female officer from the night I was locked out. Her expression softened slightly when she saw me. "Mrs. Anderson." I nodded politely. Robert gathered his folders and looked at me one final time. "Let me do most of the talking." I inhaled shakily. Okay. The walk up my own driveway felt surreal. I kept staring at the porch where my garbage bags had sat in the snow only days earlier. For 40 years I walked through that front door with keys in my hand. Now I approached it, escorted by police and a lawyer. Robert knocked firmly. Movement sounded inside immediately. Then silence. Finally, the door opened. Vanessa stood there frozen. The moment she saw the officers, her face drained of color. Then she saw Robert. Then me. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. "What is this?" she asked sharply. Robert answered before I could speak. "My name is Robert Hayes. I represent Chloe Anderson, the legal owner of this property." Vanessa's jaw tightened instantly. Ethan appeared behind her a second later. The moment he saw me standing there, something inside him visibly collapsed. He looked exhausted, unshaven, broken. Good. Maybe shame was finally reaching him. "Mom," he whispered. I said nothing, because I no longer trusted myself to speak gently to him. Robert remained calm and professional. "We are here to formally address unlawful exclusion from the property and establish immediate re-entry rights for Mrs. Anderson." Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. "She's emotionally unstable." The female officer immediately stepped forward. "Ma'am, unless you have legal medical findings supporting that claim, I suggest you speak carefully." Vanessa's face flushed. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "This has gotten out of control," he muttered. "No, it got exactly where your choices took it." Robert opened a folder. "We also have recorded statements indicating deliberate attempts to pressure Mrs. Anderson regarding property transfer and involuntary relocation." That got their attention instantly. Vanessa went pale. Ethan looked physically ill. Robert continued evenly. "We additionally possess evidence of discussions involving unauthorized plans to sell this property." Vanessa recovered first. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Robert asked calmly. Then he held up the printed transcript from Emma's recording. The silence that followed felt deafening. Ethan looked at Vanessa slowly, and for the first time I realized something important. He didn't know how much evidence existed. Vanessa stepped forward angrily. She had no right recording private conversations. She had every right to document discussions involving potential elder financial abuse, Robert replied coldly. Abuse. The word hung in the air like smoke. Ethan closed his eyes. One of the officers finally spoke. Mr. Anderson, do you currently dispute that Mrs. Anderson is the legal owner of this property? Ethan hesitated too long. That hesitation told everyone the truth. Finally, he whispered, No. The female officer nodded once. Then you cannot legally deny her access. Vanessa turned toward Ethan sharply. Don't just stand there. Something inside me finally snapped then. Not emotionally, calmly, powerfully. I stepped forward. My husband and I bought this house before you even met my son. Vanessa stared at me silently. I worked 40 years to pay for it. Still silence. You threw me out like garbage. Her expression hardened again. We were trying to survive. So was I replied quietly. That seemed to hit Ethan harder than anything else. He looked down immediately. Robert handed copies of legal filings to both Ethan and Vanessa. These proceedings will continue formally, he said. But as of today, Mrs. Anderson will re-enter her property immediately. Vanessa looked furious now. You can't just destroy our lives. Destroy your lives. Interesting choice of words from the woman who locked an elderly widow out in winter. I stared at her for several seconds, then calmly said, You already destroyed mine. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then suddenly footsteps pounded downstairs. Emma. The second she saw me, she burst into tears. Grandma Chloe. Before Vanessa could stop her, Emma ran straight into my arms. I held her tightly while she cried against my coat. I'm sorry, she kept whispering. I'm so sorry. I kissed the top of her head. This isn't your fault. Behind us, Ethan started crying silently. Actual tears, not dramatic, not manipulative. Real shame. For one dangerous second, my heart almost softened. Then I remembered the snow, the locks, the garbage bags, the door closing in my face. Love without boundaries destroys people? I finally understood that now. Vanessa suddenly snapped. This is unbelievable! She pointed directly at me. She's turning everybody against us. No, Ethan whispered hoarsely. Everyone turned toward him. His shoulders sagged heavily. She's not. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. Ethan, we did this. The room went completely silent. I watched my son carefully, really watched him, and for the first time in months, I saw the little boy I raised struggling beneath all the fear and weakness. His voice shook violently. We should never have locked her out. Vanessa looked horrified. Are you serious right now? Ethan ignored her. Instead, he looked directly at me. I'm sorry, Mom. The words hit me harder than I expected, because part of me had stopped believing I would ever hear them. But apologies do not erase damage, and consequences do not disappear because guilt finally arrives late. I looked around my living room slowly. My house, my photographs, my memories, everything suddenly felt unfamiliar, like grief had stained the walls themselves. Then my eyes landed on the family portrait above the fireplace, Michael smiling proudly beside young Ethan. A real family, or at least the memory of one. I turned back toward my son quietly. You need to leave. The words visibly shattered him, but I said them anyway, because some lessons come too late to prevent loss, and some doors close only after someone finally learns what home truly meant. Watching your own child carry boxes out of your house is a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. Even after everything Ethan had done, seeing him stand in the driveway, loading his life into the back of a rented truck, felt unreal. Like my heart couldn't decide whether it was grieving a son or mourning the death of the family we used to be. Vanessa moved first. Of course she did. The morning after Robert formally established my re-entry rights, she stormed through the house like a woman robbed of something she believed belonged to her. Which, in a twisted way, was probably true. She believed that house was already hers. I watched from the living room window as she shoved designer handbags into cardboard boxes while yelling into her phone. "This is all your fault." At first, I thought she was talking to Ethan. Then I realized she was arguing with someone else entirely. The realtor. Even now the thought makes my stomach turn. They had been that close. That close to selling the home Michael and I spent decades building together. At one point, Vanessa marched downstairs carrying framed photographs from the hallway. My photographs. She stopped abruptly when she saw me sitting quietly in Michael's old recliner. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, she held up one of the frames sharply. "Do you want these?" The bitterness in her voice shocked even me. I looked at the photograph. It showed Ethan at age 9 holding a baseball trophy while missing one front tooth. I remembered sewing his uniform by hand because we couldn't afford new ones that season. "I'll take them," I said softly. Vanessa shoved the frame into my hands harder than necessary. "You got what you wanted." I stared at her calmly. "No," I replied quietly. "I lost what I wanted." Something flickered across her face then. Not guilt, not regret. Resentment. Because people like Vanessa don't mourn relationships the same way other people do. They mourn losing control. Upstairs, Ethan moved much slower. I could hear drawers opening and closing for hours. Long silences between movements. Like he kept stopping to stare at pieces of his own life. Twice, I caught him looking at old family photographs hanging in the hallway. The second time, he quickly wiped his eyes when he noticed me watching. Part of me wanted to comfort him automatically. That maternal instinct still lived inside me despite everything. But another voice inside finally answered back, "Who comforted you when he left you in the snow?" That voice mattered too now. By late afternoon, most of Vanessa's things were packed. She came downstairs wearing a long black coat, expensive boots, and an expression full of fury. Ethan followed behind carrying boxes. Emma stood near the staircase, clutching her backpack silently. Vanessa looked around the living room one final time. Then her eyes landed on me. "You think this makes you the victim?" she asked coldly. I looked at her quietly. "I think you made your choices." Her jaw tightened. "We were trying to survive." "No," I said calmly. "You were trying to take something that wasn't yours?" She laughed bitterly. "Oh, please. Ethan's your son. That house was going to him eventually anyway. Eventually." That word again. Like my life had simply become an obstacle delaying their inheritance. I stood slowly. "And if I had died tomorrow," I asked quietly, "would you have cried before putting the house on the market?" For the first time since I met her years ago, Vanessa had no immediate answer. That silence told me everything. Ethan looked physically sick beside her. "Vanessa, stop." "No," she snapped. "I'm tired of pretending she's innocent in all this." Emma looked stunned. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa pointed directly at me. "She manipulated all of you." I almost laughed from disbelief. "Manipulated them. I spent 40 years sacrificing everything for that family. I worked double shifts while my body broke down. I paid bills while skipping meals. I gave and gave until there was barely anything left of me. And somehow in her mind, I was the manipulator." That's the terrifying thing about selfish people. They rewrite reality until guilt feels unfair to them. Ethan finally snapped then. Enough. The entire room fell silent. Vanessa stared at him in shock. He looked exhausted, destroyed. But for the first time in months, there was something else in his face, too. Clarity. "This isn't her fault," he said hoarsely. Vanessa crossed her arms. "So now you're turning on me, too?" "No," Ethan whispered. "I'm finally admitting what we did." "We, not you, not Vanessa. We." At least he was finally saying the truth aloud. Vanessa scoffed angrily. "You're unbelievable." Then she grabbed her purse and headed toward the front door. Before leaving, she turned back toward Ethan one final time. "You know what," she snapped. "Enjoy rebuilding your relationship with your mother." Then colder, "Because I'm done saving you." The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the walls. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that comes after disasters finally finish destroying everything in their path. Emma stared after her mother with tears in her eyes. Ethan sank slowly onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. And suddenly, he didn't look 40 years old anymore. He looked exhausted, small, lost, like a man waking up from a nightmare only to realize he created it himself. "I lost everything," he whispered. I looked at him quietly. "No," I said softly. "You threw everything away." Those words hit him hard. He started crying again, not dramatic sobs, just quiet, broken crying from someone crushed beneath the weight of his own choices. Emma moved toward him uncertainly. "Dad?" He looked up at her with red eyes. "I used your college money." Emma froze. I closed my eyes briefly. Hearing it aloud hurt differently. "I thought I could fix everything before anybody found out," Ethan whispered shakily. "I thought one good investment would solve everything." "But it didn't," Emma said softly. "No." The shame in his voice filled the room. I kept digging deeper, trying to recover the losses. Then Vanessa started talking about the house and... He broke off helplessly. "And you let fear turn you into someone else," I finished quietly. He looked at me like I'd struck him, because he knew it was true. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Ethan whispered the question I think he'd been terrified to ask. "Do you hate me?" The old version of me might have answered immediately, might have softened, might have rushed to comfort him. But the woman sitting in that living room had changed. Pain changes people. Truth changes people. Boundaries change people too. So I answered honestly, "No." Relief flashed briefly across his face. Then I continued, "But I don't trust you anymore." That hurt him far more than anger would have, because deep down, Ethan understood something terrible. Trust built over 40 years had been destroyed in weeks. And some damage never fully heals. Emma quietly sat beside him while he cried. I watched them together and suddenly understood something painful. Generational damage doesn't arrive in one dramatic moment. It arrives through weakness, fear, silence, bad choices left unchecked. And unless someone stops it, it keeps moving downward into the next generation. Not Emma. I refused to let this poison reach her too. That evening, after Ethan finished packing the last box, he stood awkwardly near the front door. The same door he once closed in my face. "I'll pay you back," he whispered. "Not just money. We both knew that." I looked at him for a very long time, then quietly answered, "You can't repay what you broke." Tears filled his eyes again. But this time, I didn't rescue him from them, because consequences are sometimes the only honest teachers left. The first night after Ethan and Vanessa moved out, the house felt unbearably quiet. Not peaceful, not yet, just empty. I walked from room to room, slowly touching walls and furniture, like someone returning to a home after a natural disaster. Because in many ways, that's exactly what this was. A disaster? Not the kind caused by storms or fire. The kind caused by human weakness. The kind that leaves emotional wreckage behind long after people are gone. Emma stayed with me that first weekend. Legally, things were still complicated because she was a minor, but Ethan agreed she needed space away from the constant fighting with Vanessa. Part of me suspected he also knew Emma no longer felt emotionally safe around her mother. That realization broke my heart all over again. No child should feel safer in a motel with her grandmother than inside her own home. Saturday morning, I woke early out of habit and walked downstairs expecting tension, fear, arguments. Instead, sunlight streamed softly through the kitchen windows, while silence wrapped around the house gently. Real silence, the kind I hadn't felt in years. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing. Then I noticed something strange. The kitchen smelled like coffee. Fresh coffee. Confused, I walked farther inside. And there was Emma, still wearing pajamas, standing barefoot at the stove, flipping pancakes. She looked up nervously when she saw me. "I wanted to surprise you." My chest tightened instantly. "You made breakfast?" "Well," she laughed awkwardly. "I may have burned the first batch." I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. A real laugh, not forced, not exhausted. Real. Emma visibly relaxed hearing it. See, she smiled. That's the sound I missed. I almost started crying right there in the kitchen, because I hadn't realized how long it had been since joy existed naturally inside this house. We ate breakfast together at the same table where my family had once shattered itself apart. But somehow, sitting there with Emma, the room felt different now. Lighter, not healed, but healing. That afternoon, I finally began reclaiming the house. Not legally, emotionally. I opened windows despite the cold winter air. I packed away decorations Vanessa bought that never felt like me. I brought Michael's old coffee tin back onto the counter. I rehung family photos she had removed. And finally, I brought my chair back into the living room. Patricia helped me retrieve it from the consignment shop where Vanessa had sold it months earlier. The owner refused payment after hearing the story. "Honey," she told me while helping load it into Patricia's truck, "some things belong back home." The moment I lowered myself into that chair again, tears filled my eyes. Not because of the furniture itself, because it represented something bigger. I mattered here too. My memories mattered. My life mattered. For too long, I had slowly disappeared inside my own home while trying to keep peace for everyone else. Never again. A few weeks later, Emma asked if she could continue staying with me part-time. "Dad says it's okay," she said quietly one evening while helping fold laundry. "And what do you want?" She hesitated, then softly answered, "I feel calmer here." That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know. So she stayed. Not permanently, at first. Just weekends. Then longer stretches. Eventually, the house began feeling alive again in a healthier way. Emma studied at the kitchen table while I cooked dinner. We watched old movies wrapped in blankets. Sometimes we cried together. Sometimes we laughed until we couldn't breathe. And slowly, without either of us planning it, we started healing each other. One afternoon, while cleaning out old boxes in the guest room, I found a folder containing pamphlets about elder financial abuse that Robert had given me. Emma picked one up curiously. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I didn't even realize this happened to people. It happens more than most people know." She frowned. "Why don't more people talk about it? Because shame silences people. Because mothers blame themselves. Because older women are taught to endure mistreatment quietly. But I didn't say all that. Instead, I looked around the room slowly. Then an idea formed. What if they did? Emma blinked. What if people had somewhere safe to talk about it? That idea stayed in my mind for weeks, then months. And eventually, with Patricia's help, I turned the downstairs guest room into a small community support space. Nothing fancy, just comfortable chairs, coffee, pamphlets, conversation. At first, only 3 women came, then 6, then 10. Widows, grandmothers, retired teachers, former nurses, women who quietly admitted their children controlled finances, pressured them for money, manipulated guilt, or treated them like burdens. Every story sounded painfully familiar, and every time I listened, I understood something more clearly. I was never alone. One woman cried while describing how her son kept trying to convince her she was confused whenever she questioned missing money. Another whispered that her daughter threatened nursing home placement whenever arguments happened. Fear filled those women the same way it once filled me. And for the first time since this nightmare began, my pain started becoming useful. Maybe that's how healing truly begins. Not when suffering disappears, but when suffering transforms into something that helps somebody else survive. Meanwhile, Ethan drifted quietly through the edges of my life, like a ghost. Sometimes he texted asking about Emma. Sometimes he dropped off school supplies or groceries. Always polite, always careful, always carrying visible shame. He moved into a tiny apartment across town after Vanessa left him completely. Apparently, once the house deal collapsed and the debts surfaced fully, so did her loyalty. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied about that. But honestly, I mostly felt sad. Because destruction rarely stops where people expect it to. One rainy Thursday evening, Emma found me staring out the kitchen window after receiving another short text from Ethan. "You miss him?" she said softly. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. I missed who he used to be. I missed Christmas mornings and baseball games and bedtime stories. I missed the version of my son that existed before fear hollowed him out. But grief for someone still alive is a strange kind of pain. "I love him," I finally whispered. Emma nodded slowly. But loving someone doesn't mean pretending they didn't hurt you." She thought about that quietly, then walked over and hugged me tightly. "You know what I think," she murmured. "What I think Grandpa Michael would be proud of you." That broke me completely. I cried harder than I had in months while holding my granddaughter in the kitchen of the house I almost lost. Not because everything was fixed, because it wasn't. Some wounds never fully disappear, some trust never fully returns. But standing there in that moment, I finally understood something important. Home isn't just walls and property. Home is where dignity survives, and after everything that happened, mine finally had. Almost a year passed before Ethan stood on my porch again. A full year. 4 seasons. 4 seasons of silence, awkward text messages, court paperwork, therapy appointments for Emma, and long nights where I questioned whether families can ever truly recover once betrayal enters the walls. By then, the house had changed. Not physically, emotionally. The air felt lighter now, warmer, alive again. The downstairs support group had grown so much we started meeting twice a week. Women brought homemade pies, coffee cakes, knitting bags, and stories they'd hidden for years. Stories about sons draining savings accounts, daughters manipulating guilt, grandchildren weaponized for control. Every time someone sat in my living room and whispered, I thought I was the only one, I felt something inside me heal a little more. Pain shared honestly becomes lighter somehow. That morning in October, I was watering the roses Michael planted decades earlier when I saw Ethan standing near the curb. For a second, I genuinely didn't recognize him. He looked thinner, older. The confident posture he once carried so naturally had disappeared completely. He stood there uncertainly holding a small paper bag in one hand, like a child afraid to knock on a stranger's door. My chest tightened immediately. No matter what happens between a mother and child, part of your heart still reacts automatically. I slowly set down the watering can. Ethan walked toward me carefully. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded rough, tired. "Hi." Silence stretched awkwardly between us. Then he lifted the paper bag slightly. "I brought cinnamon rolls." I almost smiled despite myself. Every Christmas morning since he was little, I made cinnamon rolls from scratch. At some point after Michael died, Ethan started bringing them to me instead. A small tradition, a peace offering, a memory. "I got them from that bakery you like downtown," he added quietly. I nodded once. "Thank you." For several more seconds, neither of us moved. Then finally, I stepped aside slightly. "You can come in." Relief flashed across his face so quickly it nearly broke my heart. Inside, Emma looked up from the dining table the moment she heard his voice. Dad Ethan smiled carefully. "Hey, kiddo." The tension between them hurt to witness. Not hatred, not anger, just sadness. The kind that comes when someone you trusted deeply becomes capable of hurting you. Emma hugged him politely, but not the same way she used to. He noticed. Of course he noticed. People eventually see the damage they caused once the panic finally fades. The three of us sat awkwardly in the kitchen drinking coffee, while autumn rain tapped softly against the windows. It almost felt normal, and somehow that made it harder. Because grief always remembers what things used to feel like. Eventually, Emma quietly excused herself upstairs, giving us privacy. The moment she disappeared, silence settled heavily between Ethan and me. Then finally, he looked down at his coffee cup and whispered, "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times. I stayed quiet. Nothing sounds good enough. Because nothing was." He swallowed hard. I ruined everything. The raw honesty in his voice caught me off guard. No excuses. No blaming Vanessa. No self-pity. Just truth. For the first time in a long time, Ethan sounded emotionally sober. "I keep replaying that day in my head," he continued shakily. The locks, the bags outside, Emma crying, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how I became someone capable of doing that to you." I stared at him quietly for a long moment before answering. "You got scared." He nodded immediately. "Yes. And instead of facing your mistakes honestly, you looked for shortcuts." More tears rolled down his face. "Yes. And Vanessa gave you someone to blame besides yourself." His shoulders collapsed slightly. I hated myself the entire time. I believed him. That was the tragedy of it all. Ethan wasn't heartless. He was weak. And weakness mixed with fear can become incredibly destructive. "I should have protected you," he whispered, "after everything you did for me." My throat tightened painfully. "You were supposed to feel safe with me." That sentence almost shattered me completely. Because beneath all the legal battles and betrayal, that was the deepest wound. I no longer felt safe with my own child. Tears filled my eyes despite every effort to stop them. "I spent 40 years loving you," I whispered, and for one moment, standing in that snow, I felt completely disposable. Ethan covered his face and cried openly. Not dramatic, not manipulative, just broken. I know, he whispered hoarsely, and I'll regret that until the day I die. We sat in silence for several minutes after that, rain tapping softly outside, coffee growing cold between us. Finally, Ethan looked at me carefully. I don't expect things to ever go back to normal. They won't. He nodded slowly. I know. That acceptance mattered. Because healing only begins once denial ends. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. What's this? I asked. I started paying back Emma's college fund. I stared at him in surprise. There's not much yet, he admitted quietly. But I got a second job. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, then back at my son. For the first time in over a year, I saw effort instead of excuses, responsibility instead of avoidance, pain instead of entitlement. And suddenly, I understood something important. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. One can return slowly. The other may never fully come back. But that doesn't mean healing is impossible. I forgive you, I said softly. Ethan started crying again instantly. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. I know. You will never have control over this house. I know. And things between us may always carry scars. Another painful nod. I know. I reached across the table and covered his trembling hand gently. But you're still my son. That finally broke him completely. After Ethan left later that afternoon, I walked slowly through the house alone, past family photographs, past the support group room downstairs filled with donated books and folding chairs, past Michael's old workshop. Everything felt different now. Not because the pain disappeared, because I survived it. A few weeks later, I officially updated my will. A large portion of the estate would go toward Emma's future. Another portion would fund support programs for elderly people facing financial abuse and family coercion. Robert smiled warmly while finalizing the documents. Your husband would be proud of you. I smiled softly. I hope so. That night, I sat alone on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood gold. The same porch where garbage bags once held pieces of my life. The same porch where my son closed the door in my face. And somehow, it no longer felt haunted. Because home isn't protected by locks. It's protected by truth, by dignity, by the courage to stop surrendering yourself just because someone calls themselves family. And after everything I lost, that may have been the most important thing I finally learned. If this story touched your heart, tell me honestly in the comments. Could you ever forgive someone who betrayed you like this? And if you're watching tonight while carrying pain inside your own family, please remember, this loving people should never require losing yourself. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Sometimes the stories we survive become the very thing that helps someone else stay strong. Life has a painful way of teaching us lessons we never wanted to learn. For most of my life, I believed sacrifice alone could hold a family together. I believed if I loved hard enough, worked long enough, forgave quickly enough, everything would eventually come back to me in the form of loyalty and love. But real life is more complicated than that. Love without boundaries can slowly become permission for others to take advantage of you. And many parents, especially mothers, spend so many years protecting their children that they forget they also deserve protection themselves. What happened to me was not just about money or a house. It was about dignity, about how easily older people can become invisible inside their own families once others begin viewing them as burdens instead of human beings. But this story is also about something else. Survival. Because even after betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak, life can still rebuild itself in unexpected ways. I lost trust. I lost the version of my family I thought would last forever. But I also found strength I didn't know I still had. I found my voice. I found other women carrying the same silent pain. And I found the courage to finally believe that protecting yourself is not selfish. It's necessary. Forgiveness matters. But forgiveness should never require surrendering your self-respect. If someone truly loves you, they will never ask you to disappear so their life becomes easier. And if you're hurting tonight because of your own family struggles, please remember this. You are not weak for loving deeply. But you must love yourself deeply too. If this story meant something to you, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted? Could you forgive them? And please tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always love reading your messages and seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family storytelling like this. Your support means more than you know.